Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razum Pereira. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently held a video conference with his counterparts from India, Australia, Brazil, Israel, Japan, and South Korea on issues related to the coronavirus pandemic. Pompeo and his counterparts discussed the importance of international cooperation, transparency, and accountability in combating the COVID-19 pandemic and in addressing its causes. The meeting also discussed collaboration toward preventing future global health crises and reaffirming the importance of the rules-based international order. This meeting comes in the backdrop of another meeting held earlier this month between senior officials of the 4 Quad countries. Quad meetings are no longer unusual, but of late, we've seen that the Quad countries have widened their scope and have added more like-minded countries, which is special. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze Quad plus diplomacy. Joining me on the program today are Patrick Gerard Buchan, Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Abhijit Singh, Head Maritime Policy Initiative, Observer Research Foundation, and Vishnu Prakash, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first. Let's analyze what you make of these developments of, if you can call it that, Quad plus.
Well, first of all, the coronavirus pandemic, it is a global crisis, is a global challenge. It's a challenge which the world in our memory has never seen. So it is very, very important that all countries, because it has affected each and every country practically, every country joins hand to share best practices, to come up with solutions, because there has to be a global pushback. So to that extent, I'm very happy that at multiple fora, the world is talking to each other, sharing experiences, and nobody is calling it Quad plus plus, but well, those of us who believe that it's Quad plus plus also has had a dialogue on the 11th of May, where the principal focus was on the pandemic. But let me turn, be the devil's advocate for a minute also at the same breath. Let me turn to the press release that was issued by the Japanese Foreign Office, because Japan was a participant. And I'm quoting the press release, says, the foremost priority at the present is to spread the infections, but it's also as important to tackle various challenges bearing in mind the state of international order after the situation winds down. Also as important to tackle various challenges bearing in mind the state of international affairs. Now that is the crux of the matter, because the fact remains that very few countries want to put their name to it. Every country almost is hesitant to call it Quad. And, it is a classical situation of be or not to be. The effort or the dialogue is still exploratory. We are tentative. Everybody knows that there is an elephant in the room. Everybody wants to dance around it. But the biggest favor that has been done to the Quad is by the elephant itself. Because more the elephant kind of behaves like a bull in the china shop, which the elephant is, the more the countries, the original Quad 4, or what was known as the 4 democratic countries, plus other countries, are now coming closer to at least exchange views. Because the fact remains that the security architecture in Asia, in Indo-Pacific region, is inadequate to meet the challenges. Frank?
Okay, all right. So before we address the elephant in the room, let me talk about another aspect. Abhijit Singh, the inclusion of Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand, all maritime countries. What do you make of this?
Well, Frank, there's been some speculation around what's happened in recent days, and there's talk that, because we've expanded the scope of discussions by bringing in other Pacific countries into this, namely New Zealand, Vietnam, and South Korea, this could possibly be the start of some kind of a broader initiative to push back China, the big elephant in the room. But I would be a bit hesitant in accepting that formulation, and for 2 or 3 reasons. First, we know well that these discussions were COVID specific. What these countries were aiming to actually discuss is response strategies. How they are coordinating their responses. Comparing notes, sharing best practices, etc. And I think the foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, even tweeted after his recent meeting that this was about the health emergency. He made it very clear that this was really not about China, but really about how we are going to be coordinating our strategies together. I think what has added some grist to the mills is that from the US side, there was a statement that we did discuss something about accountability and transparency, which is code for countering China. So this brings me to my second reason that if you look at the recent policy statements by Vietnam, by New Zealand, and also by South Korea, it would be very clear that they themselves remain very reluctant to join any kind of strategic grouping that would aim to contain China. For instance, the Vietnamese, they came up with a strategy last year, an Indo-Pacific strategy, in which they made very clear that they still stand by their three no's policy, which is that they would not get into any alliances, they would not have any foreign bases, and there would be no favoritism in their policies in terms of geopolitics. New Zealand has only last year recognized that a concept like the Indo-Pacific exists, and it has a history of being nice to China. With South Korea, I would say would be the least willing to get into any such format that pushes back against China, because the South Koreans believe that the real problem really isn't China. They believe that the problem actually could well be Japan. And in fact, in our interactions with the South Koreans, they're often telling us that you are too close to Japan for comfort. So I think that this conjecture around the Quad Plus, that it could be some sort of initiative aimed at a China encirclement or China containment, I think is a bit speculative. This is not to say that a Quad Plus is not useful. It has a great deal of utility, and I could speak a little bit later on what I see the utility in that concept. But as of now, it seems that, at least as far as India is concerned, India itself remains very wary about any containment strategy. We've gone out of our way to, you underline inclusiveness, and also mention the fact that we don't see this as an exclusive, the Indo-Pacific is an exclusive club, and we're not here to contain China. So I accept this with a grain of salt.
Okay, all right, Patrick Buchan here. This is where I'd like to bring you in and get your perspective about what's happening in the United States, because it seems like President Trump is going out all guns blazing against China and President Xi Jinping, and also what's happening as far as your home country of Australia is concerned.
Frank, firstly, you clearly, the world's media is seeing President Trump and his senior administration figures obviously really ramping up this rhetoric on China. My assessment is that's for twofold reasons. There is a lot of anger here in the United States. Obviously, the death toll here is now well past 80,000. People are 2 months have been locked away. They are looking for reasons and answers as to why that is. And China presents a pretty obvious candidate for the administration to go for. I would also assess, as we go into this, the final sort of legs of this election year, you're going to see both candidates using China as a tool in which to express their frustrations. Clearly, as I've said before, I think on your show, Frank, that there is a consensus emerging both in Washington and most importantly among the American people of the challenge and the threat indeed that China does present to the US-led rules-based order. I think in my home country of Australia, a consensus has certainly emerged in the last couple of years, not just among the national security and foreign policy elites, but again among the broader Australian people. And what you are really seeing is this values-based argument coming in to the equation on how people see China and how they think about China. No longer that sort of luxury where people sort of saw China as a huge market to do business with and to ignore the values arguments. And clearly the actions that China takes both domestically and in its foreign policy challenges people's deepest sense of what is right and what is morally right. And the actions of China under President Xi clearly make people think twice about that.
Okay, all right. Taking the discussion forward now, Ambassador, you touched upon this point in your opening remarks as well. Commander Abhijit also spoke about it, extensively, as far as how this is not about China, But at the end of the day, China certainly seems to be spooked about all of this.
Well, let me cut through the chase. The nucleus or the core or the main concern is China. It's just that every country is, to lesser or larger extent, a little bashful about admitting it. And but all the added challenge is that every country is tentative. Patrick knows Australia's case. Australia joined and then pulled out. Philippines, though not a member of Quad, had one position under President Aquino and towards China, and a completely different position towards China under Duterte. USA, you do not know after 4 years or under the next incumbency how it will play out. So there is there is one country which has been more or less consistent, that is Japan, and for reasons that we very well understand. Abhijit mentioned South Korea. I was the ambassador to South Korea. There it again depends on which party is in power. If the Democrats are in power, there is a certain orientation. If the conservatives are in power, there is a different orientation. So, and I would like to bring in our former National Security Advisor, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, just the other day at a webinar which I was attending. When asked about Quad, he said, and I'm quoting him, when the Quad decides what it is and what it is doing, what it is all about, we will know what impact it has. I don't know yet what it is about. So, the long and short is that while we have a challenge, that challenge is growing. Nobody wants to call out the challenge because you do not know how it will pan out. No country wants to stick its neck out. But there is interestingly a parallel between the formation of the ASEAN region, Southeast Asian cooperation in the 60s. The trigger was again China. They were afraid of communism and afraid of China, which brought them together. But now it's a different matter. So similarly, the concern very much is the Chinese aggressiveness. And each country finds it, and each country has invested a lot in China. So I would submit that no country wants to spoil relationship with China. India certainly does not want to do that.
All right, then taking the discussion forward. So Abhijit, you were talking about utility really as far as Quad Plus is concerned. Let's talk about the utility and let's talk about the positives and what can be achieved through Quad Plus.
Right. So in my opinion, that the Quad Plus discussion could be useful in some ways. First of all, I think it's a great forum to highlight ASEAN centrality. And one of the things that I at least see with the Quad is that whilst there's been a lot of talk about ASEAN centrality, we've not really done enough to highlight the importance of ASEAN. Take the example of the recent Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, with regard to what they are doing in the waters of Indonesia and Malaysia, as also Vietnam and their open threats to Taiwan. None of the countries, apart from the US, have actually risen to really speak for ASEAN. And I think once we have Quad Plus and we have Vietnam also in the grouping, this will in some ways highlight that ASEAN centrality that we always talk about. So that's one. I think the second way we can do it is in terms of maritime domain awareness. The fact is that on the Indian Ocean side, India has done a lot to improve the maritime domain awareness or the situational awareness. But we would really like to play a part in some security efforts in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific, because China is increasingly a player in the Indian Ocean. So it would only behoove us to have a greater footprint in the Pacific, and having greater maritime domain awareness cooperation with all of these countries would be a step in the right direction. I would also say that humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is another area that we can again have an understanding on. The fact is that we're now moving into a post-COVID world, which means that all of these countries, that the Quad countries plus other Indo-Pacific countries, are going to have less capability, operational capability to deliver the to security goods. And therefore, if we have a greater understanding in the maritime domain on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief issues, we could again be more effective in providing those security goods. The third area, and I suppose this is one of the most important areas, where a lot of talk now that centers around this, is that there is a need to remake global supply chains. You know, all of the discussion now revolves around the fact that China has appropriated a lot of these supply chains. And can we sort of look at ways in which we can do this without China? So China has been untrustworthy, you know, the manner in which it hid the facts about COVID, the manner in which it has aggressively, you know, invested in companies and failing economies, including, I mean, I wouldn't say India is failing, but, you know, when we were going through a little bit of a blitz, they were investing heavily in our markets. All of that points to the need for us to have a greater understanding, a greater cooperation when it comes to supply chain management. And I think when it comes to trade, restructuring of trade, and the remaking of global supply chains, this particular grouping could be critical, because the Quad is really a security grouping. But the Quad Plus does seem to have the ability to be more than security, to also look at a bit of economics. And finally, my final point would be we've got to look at connectivity and infrastructure. We, as these four nations, meaning India, Japan, Australia, and the US, actually have lacked the resources to develop a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative. But if we have other countries on board, for instance, South Korea, that have a lot of resources, we can have Vietnam, we have, you know, other countries in the Pacific, we could do something with building infrastructure in this region.
Okay, all right. So, Patrick, as far as Quad Plus is concerned, what do you believe is going to be the focus going forward? And you know, where are the areas, or what are the areas of cooperation?
Yeah, Frank. Look, the first thing I'd say is, you know, on the Quad, I would remind your viewers that the Quad began back in 2004 in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. That's a very important point to remember. It did not begin as some sort of grouping of, you know, the security diamond, as Prime Minister Abe refers to it, to contain China. It did not begin that way. It began like COVID, when we faced an immediate challenge, and the easiest way to coordinate from the, you know, the big four democracies of the region, so to speak, was to form a Quad officials level working group to deal with the tsunami. The second thing I'd say on the Quad Plus, my heart and my head are somewhat torn and in different places. My head tells me that we need to bed down the Quad and what it's about, and how it can work across areas of security cooperation and economic cooperation and diplomatic cooperation before we go expanding it. But my heart tells me the more the better. The more the democracies, and some countries indeed that perhaps are not democracies as we know them, Vietnam, for example, joining the so-called Quad Plus. So I think you know, again, I'm a little unsure. I co-authored a big report that came out about 6 weeks ago on the Quad, where we ran surveys, and we did a lot of analysis on examining where the Quad's at. So firstly, I think we need to bed down the Quad before we go expanding it. The other point I would make to you, we have so many multilateral frameworks within the Indo-Pacific. And unlike in Europe, for example, where there are two paramount organisations, the EU and NATO, we have so many overlapping multilateral organisations in the Indo-Pacific. I'm concerned if we rush too hard on a Quad Plus, then perhaps we only further expand that and muddy the waters and confuse what it is the Quad is meant to be. That said, I think the commander was right. The Quad Plus could represent other areas for supply chain sourcing, and again expand outside that sort of security sphere. But if we do expand the Quad Plus too early, we also risk having a two-track approach. Again, I think the ambassador noted New Zealand only just came down to a recognition of what the Indo-Pacific is. So we have various levels of understanding on where the Quad's at. So if we go expanding it too fast, I do remain concerned that we dilute what we already have in the precarious work and the diplomacy that's been put into the Quad so far.
That's a very interesting point that Patrick is making, Ambassador. There are quite a few groupings within the Indo-Pacific itself. So baby steps is the best way forward at the moment. See where the strengths lie. See where, a SWOT analysis needs to be carried out. And then we need to decide what really has to happen. And really, as far as India is concerned, what should our approach be?
Absolutely, that is precisely what I was also going to comment on. When I say we, the international community has a habit of overloading the agenda. Every forum starts off with a focus and then wants to do any and everything. It becomes a mini United Nations. It does not work like that. When it comes to economic issues, we have a G20. We have an Indo-Pacific construct, which can take care of humanitarian aspects, various aspects. The challenge and the strength of Quad is first the good news. Good news is that China was was apprehensive about Quad, and in the first flush managed to frighten countries or to persuade countries not to join it. We have crossed that bridge.
Right.
Already, at least the Quad 4 have recognized, and China has recognized that the Quad 4 will be there. Now, I think we need to consolidate that. We should, in my view, keep Quad as a mechanism of a dialogue mechanism, consultative mechanism on issues which are important. And the most important issue is security. And let other countries, if and when they join, I have reservations about Vietnam, South Korea, other countries, because they have their own concerns. But it can by and by expand. Important thing in my view is that now that we have crossed the initial period of difficulty, we should consolidate the Quad process. We have already elevated it to the ministerial level. And let us stay the course. It will take a long time, but I think it will become an important grouping which will focus on security and geostrategic issues.
All right. Abhijit Singh, as far as like-minded countries are concerned, are we going to see more cooperation going forward? Because the recent call that Mike Pompeo had also had Israel in it. So, I mean, this is something new that we are seeing. This could possibly have some potential.
Well, you made a good point. The thing is that if you have like-minded people with you and they agree on certain issues, you're likely to make progress. But you see, we've also got to learn from the Quad experience, which is that there are some areas in which you make progress, and some areas you do not. So the Quad dividend actually does not materialize across all issue areas. So when it comes to security, for instance, we have a great understanding with the US Navy, as also Japan and Australia in the Eastern Indian Ocean. But that cooperation seems to break down when we go to the West. So in the Western Indian Ocean, we actually don't have such a great, such great coordination with the US. That's because we disagree on some areas. What we have seen over the past 2 years, ever since 2 or 3 years, ever since the Quad was revived, that there is a greater focus on security in the Western Pacific, which is the South China Sea. And there is an expectation that India will somehow either speak in a loud voice about what's happening in that space, or maybe even send in its assets, somehow be part of the strategic dynamic of the Pacific. What India really wants is that some of these countries should be concerned about what is happening on the Indian Ocean. Take, for instance, China's recent forays in the IOR. The fact is, the Indian Ocean region, the fact is they're sending in more intelligence ships now into these waters. They are sending in, we already have Chinese fishing fleets, but these fishing fleets are now guarded by or protected by Coast Guard vessels. There's also great mining activity that's happening. The Chinese are deploying drones in the Indian Ocean, underwater drones in the Indian Ocean region. Now, all of this does not catch the attention of Quad states other than India, because they are too busy with the matters of the South China Sea. So I think it's great to have partners, but it's important to generate consensus on certain issues. And for India, I think the challenge is going to be generating consensus on Indian ocean security issues, not get drawn into what's happening in the Pacific, because that would be counterproductive from an Indian point of view.
Absolutely. All right. So what's the best way forward then, Patrick?
The best way forward, I think, Frank, I spoke of this earlier. Consolidate what we have in the Quad. As I noted to you, we at CSIS just released a major report on the Quad. I encourage your viewers to go to our website and have a look at that. What we found is the Quad, there is great appetite for the Quad among strategic elites, but there is still this feeling, and the ambassador spoke of the Indian National Security Advisor's comments. He is still unsure what this thing is. So we need to consolidate what we have before we go expanding it to all. The ambassador spoke, and anyone who's worked in sort of large multilateral fora knows the instance of diplomats and bureaucrats to try and go hard and go big, and then you lose what it is, what you're about. In terms of the Quad, what we have, my view is, yes, we maintain this security focus, but we also look to expand into other areas of mutual quadrilateral cooperation, equally to counter the incentives that China's BRI offers. So things like in humanitarian disaster relief, but also in areas of aid and donor cooperation and coordination that the four countries can do in the region to dilute Chinese influence, and also allow the four countries to get used to operating with one another. This is a pretty new concept for India as it's moving from, I guess, a non-alignment mentality to a strategic autonomous mentality. We'd like to see our friends in India, the great emerging power of the region, work closely and get used to working in that minilateral forum.
All right, and Ambassador, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, Quad, I think, is a good process. We need to give Quad time. I agree with my co-panelists that we need to stay focused. And the focus has to be to take up the geostrategic view, geostrategic overview of how things are panning out and how the Indo-Pacific security can be enhanced. Certainly take up other matters or other aspects which can add value to what Quad is doing. But let's not overload Quad, one. Let's not dilute the focus. We have already invested a good 10 years. We are developing some confidence. There will be back and forth, 2 steps forward, half a step or 1.5 steps back. But China's rise is a fact. China is not going to cut any slack to anybody. No single country is in a position to we don't want to contain China. We don't want to snap relations with China, but we want at least for China to play by the book. And if that has to happen, then like-minded countries like Quad, like others, have to speak in one voice and nudge China to be a more responsible member of the Committee of Nations.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.